Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, few corporations wielded as much power and influence as Standard Oil. While most Americans went about their daily lives trusting their elected officials to look out for the public good, a shadowy network of corporate manipulation was taking place behind closed doors. John D. Rockefeller and his associates had discovered something far more valuable than oil itself. They had learned to control the very machinery of government. From Pennsylvania to New York, from Ohio to Texas, governors and state legislators found themselves caught in the grip of one of history's most brazen schemes of corporate corruption. What followed was a masterclass in corporate bribery that would reshape the American political landscape and eventually spark a nationwide reckoning. To truly grasp how Standard Oil managed to bribe its way to dominance, we must first understand the landscape in which it operated. By the 1870s, the oil refining industry was, by most accounts, a chaotic mess. Dozens of small refineries competed ferociously against one another, slashing prices and undercutting margins in what became known as ruinous competition. Rockefeller saw this disorder as an opportunity, not a problem. He believed that consolidation was inevitable, that large industrial combinations would naturally replace competition in business. What he needed to accomplish this vision, however, was control over the infrastructure of American commerce, and that required getting government officials on his side. The challenge Rockefeller faced was monumental. Standard Oil needed access to pipelines, favorable railroad rates, and special charters from state legislatures that would grant exclusive rights to build and operate transportation networks. Every state had its own set of laws, its own governors, and its own legislatures. To achieve his ambitions, Rockefeller would need to systematically corrupt officials at nearly every level of state government. The task was enormous, but Rockefeller possessed something even more powerful than ambition. He had money, almost unlimited amounts of it. Pennsylvania became the testing ground for Standard Oil's political influence. The state was the heartland of American oil production, and whoever controlled Pennsylvania's legislative machinery would effectively control the nation's oil supply. It was here that Rockefeller would perfect the art of governmental corruption, creating a system that would later be replicated across the country. The strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. Identify key legislators, determine what they wanted, and deliver it in exchange for favorable legislation. In the late 1870s, Standard Oil faced a serious threat. A rival company called the Tidewater Pipeline Company planned to build a competing pipeline across Pennsylvania that would bypass Standard Oil's stranglehold on oil transportation. For Rockefeller, this was unacceptable. He responded with characteristic ruthlessness. First, he bought up land along the proposed route to physically block the pipeline's construction. When that wasn't enough, he did something far more insidious. He openly bribed Pennsylvania legislators to pass laws granting Standard Oil exclusive charters to build pipelines in the state. The beauty of this strategy was its legality, at least on its surface. These weren't shadowy backroom deals with gangsters or criminal enterprises. These were official transactions with elected representatives of the people. Rockefeller's agents would approach state legislators with proposals that were difficult to refuse. In exchange for supporting legislation favorable to Standard Oil, these officials would receive financial compensation, political contributions, and promises of profitable business dealings. The corruption was systematic, institutionalized, and deeply woven into the fabric of state government. Pennsylvania's legislature, already known for its susceptibility to corruption, became almost wholly owned by Standard Oil. The company's influence over the state legislature was so complete that historians have described Pennsylvania as experiencing what Alexander Hamilton himself, during a visit in 1794, called the political putrefaction of corruption beyond anything he had witnessed. By the 1880s, virtually every significant piece of legislation affecting oil production and transportation in Pennsylvania had been authored or approved by Standard Oil's representatives. With Pennsylvania secured, Rockefeller's organization expanded its bribery apparatus across the entire nation. Starting in 1887, as various states began filing antitrust lawsuits against Standard Oil, the company's response was not to reform its practices, but to intensify its efforts to control state legislatures. The executives of Standard Oil understood a fundamental truth about American government. If you could control enough state officials, no court in any single state could seriously challenge you. You simply shifted your operations to a more favorable jurisdiction. The network of corruption became increasingly sophisticated. Standard Oil maintained what essentially amounted to a full-time government relations office in every major state. These weren't lawyers or lobbyists in the modern sense. They were fixers, operatives who understood how to navigate the unique political landscapes of each state. They identified which legislators were corrupt and which merely needed the right incentive. They tracked voting records, identified vulnerable politicians facing re-election, and provided campaign contributions that made the difference between victory and defeat. The scale of this operation was staggering. Federal investigators would later discover that Standard Oil's attempts to bribe legislators were so numerous that they couldn't even be cataloged as exceptions to the company's normal business practices. Bribery had become the norm. In some cases, the company bribed the same legislator multiple times for multiple votes on multiple bills. The sheer quantity of money flowing through these channels was sufficient to ensure that Standard Oil's interests would always find sympathetic ears in state government. The true scope of Standard Oil's corruption becomes evident when examining specific legislative battles. One of the most revealing took place during what became known as the Tidewater Wars of the late 1870s and early 1880s. When Tidewater tried to build competing pipelines that would escape Standard Oil's control, Rockefeller's response involved not just buying land and blocking physical construction, it involved convincing state legislatures to grant Standard Oil exclusive pipeline charters. The mechanics of this operation reveal how thoroughly Standard Oil had corrupted the legislative process. A bill would be introduced granting Standard Oil the exclusive right to build pipelines in certain territories. Legislators who opposed this bill would receive visits from Standard Oil agents. The conversations would be carefully orchestrated. Sometimes the representatives would be offered direct payments. Other times, they would be offered lucrative business contracts or stock options. In cases where simple bribery didn't work, Standard Oil employed a different tactic. They threatened economic devastation. Jobs would be lost, investments would be withdrawn, and entire regions would suffer if legislators didn't cooperate. What made this particularly effective was that Standard Oil controlled so much of the regional economy that these threats were credible. When a Standard Oil executive told a Pennsylvania legislator that the company would relocate its operations to Ohio if favorable legislation wasn't passed, it wasn't an idle threat. Standard Oil had the capability and the willingness to execute it. The political calculations became simple for corrupted legislators. Vote for Standard Oil's interests or face economic ruin for your constituents. But Standard Oil's corruption extended beyond individual legislators. The company understood that governors wielded significant power over state policy and could either facilitate or obstruct its ambitions. The campaign to corrupt governors was every bit as systematic and relentless as the efforts to bribe state legislators. Governors received visits from Standard Oil's most senior representatives. These weren't casual meetings between businessmen and politicians. They were negotiations between two parties seeking to reach an understanding. Governors who were sympathetic to Standard Oil's interests found themselves showered with benefits. Campaign contributions flowed into their coffers, making them the best-funded executives in their states. Profitable business opportunities were steered toward their allies and family members. In some cases, governors were promised lucrative positions in Standard Oil or its subsidiary companies after they left office. For governors who proved resistant to Standard Oil's influence, the company employed a different strategy. It would support their political opponents in the next election, providing campaign resources that frequently meant the difference between victory and defeat. In one memorable instance, when a governor proved insufficiently cooperative, Standard Oil essentially engineered his political defeat by backing a more compliant alternative. The message was clear to other governors watching from their state capitals: cooperate with Standard Oil or face the combined political and financial might of the largest corporation in the world. The infrastructure that Standard Oil created to manage this unprecedented bribery operation was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The company maintained detailed files on every significant politician in every state where it operated. These files contain information about their political vulnerabilities, their financial situations, their ambitions, and their price. Some legislators could be bought for relatively modest sums. Others required more elaborate inducements. Some were motivated primarily by money, while others sought political advancement or business opportunities for their families. Standard Oil employed trusted agents in each state who served as the primary contacts with corrupted officials. These men, and they were almost always men, became experts at reading political situations and determining what form of inducement would be most effective in each circumstance. They maintained contact with legislators throughout the year, not just when they needed votes on specific bills. They attended political conventions, contributed to campaigns, and wove themselves into the fabric of state politics. The company's executives in New York maintained centralized coordination of these efforts. John D. Rockefeller himself was only peripherally involved in the day-to-day operations of political corruption. He had appointed trusted lieutenants to handle these matters. But the strategy and the overall direction came from the highest levels of Standard Oil's management. Rockefeller wanted an oil monopoly, and if that monopoly could only be achieved through the systematic corruption of state government, then that is what would be done. What made Standard Oil's corruption campaign so devastating was that it wasn't random or haphazard. It was part of a carefully conceived grand strategy to create a position so powerful that no competitor could challenge it and no government could threaten it. By corrupting state legislatures, Standard Oil ensured that no state would ever pass laws that seriously threatened the company's interests. By controlling governors, Standard Oil ensured that the executives of individual states wouldn't use their power against the company. But there was an even more sophisticated dimension to this strategy. Standard Oil used its control over the state government to prevent the very federal intervention that might have been necessary to break its power. State legislators controlled federal representation. They often influenced who would represent their states in Congress. By controlling state officials, Standard Oil had substantial influence over federal politics as well. When Congress considered legislation that might threaten the company's monopoly, Standard Oil's allies in the House and Senate were there to protect the company's interests. It was a system designed to be essentially corruption-proof. Standard Oil had created so many layers of political protection that dismantling its power would have required an extraordinary national mobilization. Competitors couldn't bring legal challenges because state legislatures created the laws that competitors had to obey, and those legislatures were controlled by Standard Oil. Reformers couldn't appeal to state governors because governors owed their positions, at least in part, to Standard Oil support. The company had, through systematic bribery, created a political structure that made its monopoly almost impossible to challenge through normal governmental channels. But then something remarkable happened. A woman named Ida Tarbell decided to investigate Standard Oil. Beginning in 1902, she published a series of articles in McClure's magazine detailing the company's predatory practices. What made Tarbell's work so devastating was that she didn't just attack Standard Oil's business practices. She exposed the corruption that made those practices possible. She revealed the systematic bribery of legislators, the manipulation of governors, and the network of corruption that reached into every state legislature in the nation. Tarbell's articles, later compiled into a book titled The History of the Standard Oil Company, became a sensation. Here, in carefully documented detail, was the entire machinery of Standard Oil's corruption laid bare for the American public to examine. It turned out that Americans didn't particularly care if Standard Oil's executives became rich through efficiency and superior business practices. But they did care that their elected officials were being bribed, that state governments had been captured by corporate interest, and that the people's representatives were serving not the people, but a powerful monopoly. The publication of Tarbell's work triggered a cascade of consequences. State prosecutors began taking antitrust actions more seriously. Reformers, emboldened by public support, began demanding federal action. Presidents and presidential candidates sensed that taking on Standard Oil was politically popular. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The trial, which took place in 1908 before a Missouri federal court, featured more than 400 witnesses and provided overwhelming evidence of the company's corruption. Federal investigators presented evidence of illegal railroad discounts, blockades of competing pipelines, spying on competitors, and, crucially, the systematic bribery of elected officials at every level of government. When the case reached the Supreme Court in 1910, the justices didn't need to hear elaborate arguments about economic efficiency or the proper scope of corporate power. The evidence of corruption was simply too extensive. The court found that Standard Oil had engaged in restraint of trade and ordered the company to dissolve into 34 separate companies. The breaking of the Standard Oil monopoly became one of the most significant victories for reform in American history. But here's what's crucial to understand. Standard Oil's corruption campaign didn't fail because of some inherent flaw in the strategy. It didn't fail because state legislatures suddenly became more ethical or more resistant to bribery. It failed because a single courageous journalist decided that the truth mattered more than the powerful interests arrayed against her, and because the American people, when confronted with clear evidence of their government's corruption, decided that this was unacceptable. The irony that Standard Oil's executives might have appreciated had they possessed the capacity for such reflection was that their very success in corrupting state government created the conditions for their downfall. They became so confident in their control over American politics that they ceased to hide their activities. The machinery of corruption, designed to be invisible, became visible through the sheer scale and scope of its operations. When Ida Tarbell began investigating Standard Oil, she found that the company's corruption wasn't buried in a few backroom deals. It was woven throughout the entire structure of the state government. Nearly every significant piece of legislation affecting oil production and transportation bore the fingerprints of Standard Oil's manipulation. The story of how Standard Oil bribed every governor in America is not merely a historical curiosity. It remains relevant today as a cautionary tale about what can happen when corporations accumulate enough power and wealth to effectively purchase the governmental apparatus that is supposed to regulate them. Standard Oil demonstrated that it was possible to create a system of political control so comprehensive that it could only be broken by an extraordinary mobilization of public opinion, combined with courageous individuals willing to expose the truth. The dissolution of Standard Oil in 1911 represented a moment when American democracy reasserted itself against corporate capture. But it also represented something more. It demonstrated that the problem was never really the corruption of individual governors or legislators. The problem was a system in which corporations possessed enough power and wealth to tempt officials into corruption in the first place. Standard Oil succeeded in bribing its way to dominance not because American officials were uniquely corrupt, but because Standard Oil possessed a uniquely overwhelming concentration of economic power. The story of Standard Oil reminds us that democracy requires not just virtuous officials, though that is certainly desirable, but also a structure of distributed economic and political power. When power becomes too concentrated, corruption becomes almost inevitable. not because humans are inherently evil, but because the incentives align in ways that make corruption the rational choice for those seeking power and security for themselves and their families.